Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where today we're not only checking out the cover CDs, but also the magazine that it came from. So after the zones and the formats, it's time to check out the Ultimate PC. This is the December 1998 issue, and amazingly it's still mostly sealed. And I just knew as soon as I spotted it that I had to buy it and open it up. Ultimate PC was a relatively short-lived UK PC gaming magazine, made by Rapid Publishing, who also made the total range of console magazines. It only lasted a few years from 97 to 99, and its big hook at the time was its price. It launched at just £2.50, and eventually went up to £3.95. But even at that price, it was still cheaper than everyone else. And this was quite the bumper mag, as it came with 2 cover CDs as well as almost 200 pages of content. So I think it's time that we start looking at the magazine itself. Now hopefully you won't mind this being a little bit looser than the type of videos I normally do, as I just want to flick through this and just find some interesting things to talk about. And then obviously we'll be looking at the CDs as well. And so let's just jump in. And well, right away we start off with an advert. We're going to see a lot of adverts in this magazine. And we have the usual editorial and then another advert. Jumping in, we get to the front lines. So these are the sort of stuff that was just happening at the time. And I do love the fact that it's going on about Activision signing both Star Trek and Star Wars. And the Activision Star Trek stuff, that was good. And then over here we can see that Bitmap Brothers are returning with Z2. Now Z, decent game, really fun, some nice comedic action and some really difficult strategy. It's a game I've been meaning to cover but not got around to it, but Z2, yeah, it's not particularly well remembered, and I think for good reason. It turns out that this was produced just after the ETTS, which was the Electronics Computer Trade Show, and basically it was a gaming exhibition, a bit like E3 but in the UK, and it was just for the press, in theory. I get drawn straight to this, the Babylon 5 game that never was. I'm a huge Babylon 5 fan, and I always wish there was a proper B5 game, and basically images like this was the closest we got. And it's funny that that image is there, and down here, with the rest of them being Half-Life, which will show up a few times in this magazine. The other interesting bit on this page is here, Braveheart for PC. It is actually a game I have, it's on the shelf over there. And it's okay, it's a bit of an odd one. Another game that at some point I might have to cover. The rest of them, it mostly splits it up by the publishers. So we've got some more stuff from Interplay, they talk about more Star Trek titles. There seems to be a bit of repetition in some of these articles. But we get to see Ubisoft, GT Interactive, sports, yeah, I don't care about sports, but an advert for BT, particularly BT Highway. And then these are the sort of hot off the press, brand new things. Again, something we're going to see a bit of, or technically not see much of, Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun, which still hadn't been released at this point. And this is basically telling us it's still coming. And, oh, look at this. A preview for Black and White, which is meant to be the next big game, particularly from Peter Molyneux. And that logo, the Lionhead Studios logo, bittersweet for me. I was there at the very end. Literally at the very end of that company, I was working there. Never got to meet Peter Molyneux, he had long gone by that point. So it's quite funny seeing this little interview with them, and one of them is, "Are you a control freak normally?" His response, very competitive rather than a control freak. Good to know. But it's interesting seeing some of these early screenshots of Black and White. And just look at that one. Let's look at that. Looks absolutely gorgeous. And more football. We'll see a bit of sports. I'm not a sports fan. We all know that I'm not a sports fan. And we come on to Prince of Persia 3D. This isn't Sands of Time. This was the one before that, and as far as I'm aware, this went down like a lead balloon. It wasn't well received at all. But this, Baldur's Gate, was. It's not the type of game that particularly interests me, but I know it was very popular. Where something like this, Warzone 2100, that would be something I'd play more of. I think I do have a copy, but I don't think I ever got around to playing it. So, yeah, this preview probably had an impact on me and ended up spotting it for sale at some point in the future and going, I remember that game. And I was saying earlier about we're going to see repeats. Well, here on the drawing board, so this is just meant to be a quick recap of things coming up. We get to see Star Trek Klingon Academy again, as well as Star Trek New Worlds, which I think came out, but I don't think it was particularly well received. And so we're going to stop briefly on this page. It's not for Apache. It's not even for the fact that this is a competition to win a computer. It's the computer itself. This LNX branded machine. Now, the very first computer I got when I went to university, so the first computer I owned just for me was an LNX branded computer. And I still have the box of system manuals and stuff for that computer. I don't have the computer anymore, but I still have this box, and I think it was this machine rather than the smaller one here. It was branded Sentia, and I had all the system requirements on the side of the box and everything. But yeah, that is a real trip down memory lane just seeing that box. So let's move on, and first feature article. So this is it talking about the top first-person shooters of the time. With saying that some of the best is Quake 2. Definitely agree. Klingon Honor Guard. A good one, but I think it was flawed. But I've not played it in quite some time. And the interesting thing is that that launched with the Unreal Engine before Unreal did. Which is weird. It's something I've been considering going back to and playing and maybe doing a review on it. So I know my Star Trek reviews don't always do great, but if that interests you, let me know. Unreal, obviously an absolute classic game. Jedi Knight, Star Wars, not a great combination. And then Duke Nukem 3D, classic game. They're saying it may look a little dated now, but they don't come much better than this. Humor and violence all in one. So the next page is the Young Guns. These are the new games that's coming out that might take the crown. Which includes Sin. A pretty decent game. It was buggy on launch, and yeah, it wasn't quite as good as the games that most people remember from the time. Duke Nukem Forever, well, that version never came out. Daikatana, well, that definitely didn't take the crown. And then they got Quake 3 here, which they just showed pictures of Quake 2. That definitely became a big one. But Half-Life, our second viewing of it. And yes, that definitely became a monster. Absolute monster for first-person shooters. And we've got some more sports stuff. An advert for Creative. And particularly their 3D cards. So they were making 3DFX cards at the time. Very short-lived entry for them. But here we come to the actual Half-Life preview. Now, the funny thing is that when this came out in December, Half-Life was starting to show up on the shelves. It actually got released before most magazines got to review it. At least the finished version. Here they're playing a pre-release one. But I think by the time that this magazine came out, I might have already had a copy of Half-Life, which I bought before I read a single review. Which was risky at the time, because it literally took up a third of my hard drive space to install. And I was very tempted to return it. Now, people complain about games taking up too much hard drive space these days, but I don't think there's any one game that takes up an entire third of their hard drive space anymore. But this one, yeah, this was worth it. And yes, obviously they talk about the story of Half-Life. They show off the skeletal animation system as well. But also, they like to talk about the graphics and saying the game is visually blinding. It is. It looked lovely at the time. But the Valve engine also supported software mode with all the effects. Now, at the time, most of the sort of effects that it was doing, with like lighting and all that lot, only happened if you had a 3D card. Like Quake 2 we saw earlier. It only had coloured lighting if you use a 3D card. Where Half-Life had to do it in all of it because it was integral to the game. Ooh, and I know this one will be quite big for a few people, Thief. Like, I'm not into my sneaky games, so it's not really for me, but I know people loved Thief. And it's, again, we get to see some early screenshots of the game. Quite a few of the games that we end up seeing are ones that barely remember these days. Like, they just came and went, and that's it. And this is one of those, ODT, Or Die Trying. Now, we get to see a demo of that on the CD, but I think it was like we saw an advert for it at the beginning of this. It was pushed quite a bit at the time, but I couldn't tell you anything about it at all. And here it is saying that its chart position is probably going to be the top 50. They thought it was going to be pretty decent. So it's interesting to see what they thought was going to be big. And talk about forgotten, look at this. Gameplay. This was how we had to order games. I was going to say online, but you could cut this out, send it off with... You just write your card number in. Oof. Not something we would do today. Or you could send a check. Or you could phone them up and read your details over the phone to them. So you'd say which game you wanted, your address and everything, and order it online. Not online, over the phone. It's interesting to see some of the prices. So we'll get in closer, but you could now get, in 98, a Voodoo 1 card for 50 quid. It's interesting to see some of the speakers they're trying to sell and controllers. And just some of the games. Right, coming over here, we have Duke Nukem 3D. £13. Oh, just £13 for Duke Nukem 3D. Definitely not that much these days. But moving on, we still have more previews. Apache. Global Domination, nope. Railroad Tycoon 2, a game I should play. I'm a big fan of my railroad style games, so definitely one I should have a look into. Again, more sports, nope. And another advert for Where in the World? PC World. And I used to love going around their physical shops, buying the stuff, and look, You get a Voodoo 2 for 150 quid. A Banshee for £100. Cost you a lot more to get these cards these days. A lot of sound blasters and everything. And here we go. I was talking about Tibsun would show up again, and it does. Because, yeah, this was one of the most highly anticipated games for the PC at the time. And it just kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And yeah, we'd see pictures like this, and we'd know it's the cutscenes, but the Command & Conquer and the Red Alert cutscenes were amazing. So yeah, we wanted to see the actors and everything, and the game itself. Just look at the coloured lighting and everything that was going on. These looked awesome. And they were talking about how the graphics and how it would change, like rivers would freeze and thaw throughout the game and make things more difficult for the vehicles, and like the Mammoth tanks had multiple moving parts, and I'm not sure how much that ended up in the final thing. I remember them talking about how the terrain would be destructible and you'd be able to alter it, but it then just ended up being there's some points you could shoot and it would change. So it felt like there was a lot of hype for this game and a lot of promises that may or may not have come around. But it was definitely magazine articles like this that made us believe that hype. And we're coming roughly back to the middle, so they've got this must-buy section. For some reason, it's like a mini magazine within a magazine. It's not in the full size. They could have just had it as a separate baggie, but we'll go through it as well. And I think when we get through this, it'll be time to start looking at the CDs. So let's see what they think is going to be the must-buy games, particularly as they're looking towards next year. So Final Fantasy VIII, they're expecting to be a big one, and most people forget that Final Fantasy VII and VIII. Another big one, Diablo 2. I know it's a particular favourite of a lot of people. And then we have games like Kingpin. So it's amazing how many of these sort of games came out around this time. Kingpin, Sin, Half-Life, Tiberian Sun. But here, first showing of Max Payne. Release date still to be determined. I think it came out in 2000 rather than 99. That is a stunning game. Much, much better than the game above it, Prince of Persia 3D. Age of Empires 2. Definitely a huge, huge title. So big that it's still being sold today. And for good reasons. It is an absolute stone cold classic. As is Alpha Centauri. Well, reviewed it already. Still amazing. And to think that came out in supposedly in 99. Awesome, awesome title. Duke Nukem Forever, well, we know that definitely did not come out then. But Aliens vs Predator, that was another landmark title. Not one I ever particularly got into, but I know a lot of people who did. Homeworld, another big one. Very small sort of inserts here. Which is surprising considering its cult status. Where they give a big thing to Galleon? I don't remember that one at all. And don't know what's going on with that model. Giants Citizen Kabuto. This was a big one at the time because this was the game to show off what shaders could do. So it had the very fancy water. It was one of the early titles to support it. And yeah, it was at a time when shaders were gimmicks still. They weren't important. Outcast, oh, another huge, huge game. Again, given a very small box. Where Delta Force, they gave a lot of space to. which is a game I never really got into. I know it had a very fancy graphics engine, which is in lots of ways similar to Outcasts, but I much preferred that. Black and White, we've seen already. They talk a lot about Star Trek games here, and some of them ended up coming out. Star Trek: The Secret of Vulcan Fury, which is meant to be the third in the Interplay point-and-click adventures. It never came out, which is a bit of a shame. But they do talk about some of the other games that's on the way, most of which did come out, like Star Trek Klingon Academy, for example. Dungeon Keeper 2, another absolute classic that did come out, also very good. More sports titles. And Discworld Noir. The first two Discworld games I know are brutally hard, and I don't have those. And I probably should give them a proper go. I have the box of Noir, but not the game. But I'm not sure if it had quite the same level of moon logic as the others. I could be wrong. And that was their guide to the next year. And a game that we saw earlier. So we are roughly 100 pages in. And we now start to come on to the actual review. So we're all halfway through the magazine. And it's been just previews and talking about what's coming in the future. As well as a lot of adverts. I'd almost say that 50% of those pages were adverts. But before we get into the reviews proper, let's take a look at the CDs. Inserting the disc, we get a menu, as was the style at the time, and was done in Macromedia. And it's interesting that it tells you how to insert the disc and get this menu up in the menu itself. But it is a simpler one than some that we've seen before, as it's really just two options, the games and some utils, which includes various versions of DirectX. But the games, well, there's quite a few, and I think we should start with Sin. That has a full menu that allows us to change the controls to WASD, as most of the games at this point were still defaulting to the arrow keys. But after we sort that out, we're into the intro, and that is all in engine.
It's not good, boss. We've lost contact.
So some parts of this game were very forward thinking. And the first level is also quite unique for the time, as we're using a turret in a helicopter. Now this would go on to become a major staple of early 2000s FPS games, but at this point it's still quite fresh. And even has most of those hallmarks of the trope, as you can blow up cover, you can shoot down billboards, and you have to take out rockets that are trying to get you. But once we get out on foot, we find that that billboard that we shot down, well, that's there in the level, so that's really quite nice. For those of you that aren't in the know, Sin and Half-Life had been fighting it out in the previews for a good year or so, with both being poised to become the next big thing. But as the talk that Half-Life was getting ready to launch, well, that made the publishers of Sin nervous, which resulted in the game being pushed out before it really should have done. And let's just say it didn't help at all, as it launched at near the same time as its competitor, but it was in a much buggier state. And there's a few points in this demo where we get to see that, as I had to no-clip through doors that got broken. Now the patches that would follow fixed up many of these issues, but at that point the damage had been done. Half-Life was doing great, and Sin, well, it was seen as an interesting but buggy game. Now if they'd left it in development a little bit longer and launched say half a year later, I think it would have done a lot better, as it has area damage, different armor types, and quite the range of interactivity. It even has some interesting level designs. As this first one, it's quite large. But unfortunately, while I think that Sin is a good game in its own right, with unique weapons, story and gameplay mechanics, it got looked at as the runner-up to Half-Life, where really it should be considered its own thing. So I'm interested to see what happens with Sin Reloaded. It's a little bit late at the moment, but I am still looking forward to it. So let's move on to the next demo, which is Sensible Soccer. As it seems to say in my contract that I have to keep covering this game, even in its 1998 incarnation, which had moved from those 2D sprites to using 3D models, but still trying to keep that top-down view. And it also seems to say in my contract that I have to suck at this game, and the AI easily wins the first match. And in a throwback to those previous Sensi demos, the game ends after the first goal. Thankfully, I did a little bit better in my second attempt, but it was still a 0-0 draw. For the most part, it looks fine, if a little stuttery in places, like the animations can't quite keep up. But I can't really comment too much on the game, as it's really just not for me. And moving swiftly on, we find Speedbusters from Ubisoft, a game that I don't recall playing before, or really even seeing, well, apart from the adverts that they had plastered in the mag. And this looks to be an arcade-style racer, that you get to buy your souped-up car and then go race on a quite interesting map. This one seems to be based around Hollywood. And after starting on the beach, you'll eventually make it into the backlots of the studios, with dinosaurs and the like that you have to avoid. And then it's up into the hills, and then you get to loop back round again. Now this was also released on the Dreamcast under the name Speed Devils. And I actually had a lot of fun with this one, more than I was expecting. The driving model is interesting, and the maps, or at least this one, has a lot going on. So it's far more varied than some of the racing games that I could have picked from the CD. But outside of having some nice support for 3D cards, and having some detailed graphics for the levels and the car models, I don't have too much to say about this one. And it seems the next demo is sneaking up on us as it's Commandos Behind Enemy Lines, a game and demo that I played quite a bit, and I can tell you, I never got far into it, as this game was known to be punishing. And this demo really helps show that off, as you start with 3 soldiers that have been split from each other, and you have to try and get them back together and then take down a radio tower. The end goal isn't that important, as we're not even going to get that far.
Yes, sir.
One of the big innovations for the game was the enemy view cone, as they were constantly on the lookout just for you. And using an icon, you can select an enemy and have it visualized, which greatly helps with trying to plan your movements. But you can't see all of them. I think they changed that though for the later games. So using this, you can really plan and try and sneak up on the enemy, or you can just shoot them, as I ended up doing, I guess.
Come on over. Come on over. Okay.
I'm not exactly known for being the most sneaky player when it comes to these type of games, and unfortunately this is what this game is really all about, planning and sneaking, and then trying to take out your enemies without being spotted. But amazingly, I managed to take down all the local enemies and then worked out how to use some of the soldiers' special abilities to be able to come together and then use the boat. And this is just about where my game ended, as I got spotted at a distance and then killed. Commandos was a game that spawned a number of follow-ups, and if you like this type of real-time planning, then you should go check it out. The last demo for this CD had to be Carmageddon 2. A game that you can quite clearly see the bones of the previous entry, but everything has been improved and fixed up, as it was built on the 3DFX version of the game, and it managed to look and move so much better than before, with more detailed car models and more stuff going on as well as coming off. The environments have more to them as well, as you can now break into buildings and smash through fences, all of which they wanted to show off, as the course that they had planned out takes you through one of the buildings and then cross some rooftops before crashing through a fence and into a construction site. And yes, you can still run over zombies and crash into the other cars to take them out. But there's now some new power-ups and random icons, like being able to give the zombies big heads, or making them grow to twice their size. And these are now all done with models rather than the sprites they were before, so it shows how much has changed in the few years between the games. The extra HUD is also quite welcome, as well as the minimap in the corner, as it gives you an idea of what the other cars are currently doing. Now you could get the information in the previous game, but you had to hit the tab button and then bring up a full screen map. Now, like the original game and its demo, this one is timed, but there is quite a lot for you to explore, so you may want to go off the beaten path to try and see what's out there. And I think it's time we moved on to the other CD that was full of Psygnosis games, starting with The Sentinel Returns. Now this was the sequel to The Sentinel, an 8-bit classic, and in this one they've decided to go with a very odd style, as it's all a little bit otherworldly. But I guess it fits in with the rather odd gameplay, as you are this robot, and your goal is to absorb items in the world. And that will give you energy that allows you to build boulders as well as new robots. And then you can transfer yourself between them. And your goal is to try and get higher up the map, as you can only absorb things that are beneath you. The eventual plan is to try and get high enough that you can absorb the Sentinel itself, which is sitting at the highest point on the map looking down on its land. And if it happens to glance your way, it will try to absorb you instead. So you have to be quite sneaky and fast to try and take it down, and then you can finish the level. It's a bizarre, fun and interesting game, and this demo has a few maps for you to check out. And it was this demo that made me want to buy the full thing when I first played it. And it's a game that I have also been considering doing a review on. The next demo is for a bit of an older title, Wipeout 2097. And I get the feeling that this was designed for slightly slower hardware, as it's feeling a little bit too fast on this Pentium 3. But then the CDs do also say that they're for Windows 95 only, but I guess I should be happy that it's running at all, as some of the games, well, we'll see, they have issues. The demo is just for the first level of the game, so it's one that most people who've played it before will know, and for the most part it's fine enough. It's not the best port ever made. The shadows, well, they seem to almost glow in the darker areas, which is just wrong, and some of the effects don't seem to have the right transparencies. Now it's possible it's because we're using newer hardware and so it's having some weird conflicts, but I remember it having a few problems back in the day. But then the PC wasn't the main platform for this game. The demo is also missing the music, which for me might be a blessing, but it does have all the sound effects and voice samples. It's one of those odd curios from a time where Psygnosis were defying their owner, Sony, and were releasing games on other platforms, something that they would start to put their foot down in the coming years. The compatibility issues that I was talking about come to bite us next, as I tried to show off ODT, or Die Trying, as I had to switch to my Windows 95 machine, as it kept crashing when trying to launch it on the Win98 one. It's possible the combination of graphics cards was really confusing it, but either way, it's running fine here. And after some limited options being a demo, we get into the game, that has a very Tomb Raider feel and style to it, as it's a third-person adventure. Now these were really starting to take off at this point, with everyone trying to get in on the act. But this isn't one that I really remember. Graphically it seems fine if it's got a little bit of a short draw distance. And right away the game is throwing some combat at us, and we seem to have some sort of gun. Exploring this starting room, and there seems to be a console that we need a key for, as well as a lever that informs us that it goes both directions. Don't worry little guy, I'm the same. The controls are still very much of its time. Very tank-like, but not quite as rigid as some of them that we've seen. But it's not as smooth as what we've seen later. The level continues with us using turrets to shoot other turrets, as well as collecting mana and spells? Well, this seems a bit odd, as the level designs and baddies hint at a more sci-fi style game, but the pickups are giving me more of a fantasy vibe. So I'm really not sure what to make of this game, and I'm not sure there's enough in this demo to really make sense of it all. But it has made me intrigued enough that I might go out and check out the full thing, even if just to try and work out what's going on here. And the last demo that I was going to check out turned out to be, well, it was just a video that ended up playing in this tiny window in the launcher. So let's try that again in full screen, as it's what they call a rolling demo, or just a video, for Draken, which is wearing its influences quite clearly. Very clearly, in fact. Now, there was a demo for this, but that must have come out later, as I remember playing and enjoying it. It's a game that I've attempted to review a few times, and I will get round to it at some point, as it lets you fly around on a dragon. But you can get off and you can then go around on foot as well, and you have to use both depending on the situation. It's quite the ambitious game, particularly for its time, and obviously that made it a little bit janky as well. But it was a surprisingly well done game, even if this video is focusing mostly on two things. But then this was the late 90s, and who else was the marketing people trying to aim these games at? Now, there were a few other older demos on this CD, like Lemmings 3D, but I think I'm going to spare you from that, and instead, let's return to the magazine. And returning to the magazine, we're in the back half, which turns out to be the review section. And interestingly, they have this set of icons. So games that get 90 to 100% are explosive, must buy. Between 85 and 90, well, it's just hot property. But if it's under 40%, then it's hazardous, do not touch. Which is interesting, because it means that they must plan to use the entire range of that 100%. Does it mean that? Well, we will see as we look at the reviews, and there's a few of them to do so. And we start off with, well, it's Heretic 2. And I love the fact that this page basically just looks like another advert. I think that was the box art, but even still. This was a game I remember being pushed quite a bit at the time, and I played Heretic, I played Hexen 2. I didn't really play this one. It wasn't the move to third person, as they say, like, it's going to get comparisons to Tomb Raider, but it's inaccurate. It wasn't that, it's just Heretic I enjoyed, but it wasn't my favourite. Heretic 2, I wasn't battering down the doors of the shops to go buy it. Even though it does look quite nice. But Fantasy, it's not quite my thing. It is a decent game, and they dedicated a lot of pages to it. For them to eventually say, well, it got a 90 out of 100. Supposedly it takes the Quake 2 engine on several strides with some nice graphics and new styles of gameplay. But experienced Heretic or Hexen players might be a bit reluctant to give the third person view a chance. And their verdict, a more than worthy addition to the Heretic Hexen saga, which is going to be a big hit with multiplayer players the world over. If you don't get it, you don't get it. Interesting that they talk about the multiplayer side of things, because I don't think I remember anyone talking about the multiplayer side of Heretic 2. People were just really interested in its single player story. And it's interesting that we'll see a lot more talk of multiplayer games as we go through this magazine. Or at least multiplayer modes. And that will continue with Carmageddon 2, Carpocalypse Now. A great sequel. And I was a huge fan of the original game. I have a copy of it, I got the Splat Pack. I had the 3DFX patches for it. Yep, I put a lot of time into the original. I didn't put quite as much into Carmageddon 2, I think just because I spent so much time with the first one. And something that they do for some of the reviews is other options, so other games that you might want to look into other than this one. Now, they never reviewed Carmageddon because it was before their time, but they would give it, these days, 75%. Interstate 76, well, that would get a 70% now. And Grand Theft Auto, well, it's one of their earlier ones, they would give it 85%. Now, the original Grand Theft Auto, the top-down one, much more of a fan of that than the 3D ones later. But what did they say about Carmageddon 2? Well, it's fun, challenging, graphically impressive. More impressive than my pronunciation. And always varied. It improves on the original in every way, which it did. Against the amount of sound samples for PEDs are quite limited and can get quite repetitive. Also, very true. And the verdict, funny, action-packed and terrific to play. It's an instant classic. It's highly addictive in one-player mode, and the internet option is the icing on the cake. 92%. And again, yeah, talking about multiplayer. That was starting to become a much bigger thing, and people were starting to expect these games to have multiplayer options, particularly online multiplayer as well. And continuing on, well, we're going to see a lot of racing games, because that was still a huge part of the PC's sort of lineup. Well, it did very well on 93%, but it's not the type of game that I've played all that much. And neither was Battlespire, which got a 51. Ooh, that is not good. It's not one I remember at all. And yeah, this review doesn't really sort of make me want to go out and get it either. Unfortunately, we then come on to Sensible Soccer, which is the newer sort of 3D one. Look at these lovely models. And they gave it quite a high score. But Sensible Soccer, if you've seen my cover disc videos, you'll know that I don't get on very well, and we've seen it in the game demo as well. The majority of the reviews we're going to see are sports and racing games. It's actually quite ridiculous. So it's thankful that we get something a little bit different in V2000. Now this is a follow-up to Virus or Zark, for those who remember it, or even Lander, if you remember it way back on the Archimedes. I knew of this because this box art, it was also used for adverts, and it was everywhere, absolutely everywhere. But I don't recall seeing it in the shops. It was quite difficult to get your hands on it, I felt. At some point I might have to get a copy just to see what it's like, because the original Virus was a interesting, cool game that was so difficult to control. So this could be quite a lot of fun if they manage to fix that up. And, well, they say that craft controls are very difficult and camera angles obscure the play, so maybe they didn't fix that up. But it's still got 83, which isn't too bad from this magazine. And sports, we got Tiger Woods. Moving on. And we have another racing game. This one didn't do quite as well. And then we have Red Jack, Revenge of the Brethren. I don't recognize any of this. I don't know if I blanked it or if it just came and went without any sort of recognition. At 70%, it was obviously No Monkey Island. And then we get a flight sim. So the big three things we'll see: sports titles, flight sims, and racing games. And we get another sports title, but this is a manager game. This is long before Football Manager sort of took over everything. So there's quite a few companies trying to battle it out in this area. And Gremlin are back with Actua Tennis. No thank you. And we have Need for Speed 3. One I don't recall much of, but 80%, not bad. Better than Brunswick Circuit Pro Bowling. A pitiful 45%, and managed to get the hazardous sign, even though I think it was meant to be lower than that to get those icons. It must have been pretty bad. And we get a Formula 1 manager now, which, some nicely drawn graphics here, and looks like there could be some 3D stuff, but yeah, it did not review well. And we get the Israeli Air Force flight sim. And here's an interesting one, The Fifth Element. I don't know how to take this review, because the first thing they say is, the film was a bit of a flop on all accounts. The film was not a flop. Well, I don't know if it did all that well at the box office, but it's an excellent film. I love it. But I don't know how well the game did. And I'm going to guess that they focused on a few things from the film to try and make it appeal to the teenage boys of the time. But it didn't score very well. The thing is that they, again in this verdict, a very disappointing attempt to capitalize on a rather lame sci-fi film. I cannot agree with that, so I have to take this review with a big pinch of salt. Though, I get the feeling it probably wasn't very good. I think it was mostly a PC and Dreamcast game, if I remember rightly. We then get some Montezuma's Return. Something I recall the name of, but yeah, didn't really play. And talking about V2000s, there was a lot of adverts like this. Supposedly PC Format had already reviewed it and gave it 88%, and PC Zone gave it 90%. So it's a bit different to this magazine. And amazingly, that's the core reviews. But they do look at expansions, with Quake 2, Ground Zero being one of the big ones, and they don't give them scores. They mostly just talk about them a little bit, and the bigger ones, well, they have this little box out. Grade it on like value for money, new features, extended gameplay, and just how good it is overall, which is a nice way of doing it, I think. And it's definitely cool for some of these expansions, because while people go on about the classic expansion packs and how they were great, quite often they didn't add much to the game. They weren't worth the money. So, but then occasionally you got ones like the Quake 2 expansions. They were great, but they weren't the norm. They really weren't. Oh, and we get to see some multimedia. Do you want to try and plan a route? PC hardware diagnostics and fixes for the Millennium Bug? Yes, that was still a big thing at this point. And then Oscar the balloonist discovers the farm. Well, as long as he didn't buy the farm. And this is always the fun bit. They had questions and answers where people would write in. Some of the questions were always a bit weird. Like just complaining about reviews. Heart of Darkness, impossible. I shot out to buy it, however, after 2 days I discovered that the use of the word impossible, to paraphrase your review, would be a missed opportunity to use the words too easy. After reading your review of Heart of Darkness, which said the game was almost impossible, I decided that a challenge was what I really wanted in a computer game, so I went out and bought it. You're repeating yourself a bit here, mate. Heart of Darkness is a difficult game. It does require a lot of repetition and learning how to play each individual section. I do have a copy of it over there, and maybe we'll review it at some times if I manage to complete it. Like how they basically say, oh, you must be a super player if you found it easy. If you want something difficult, try something like Commandos. Commandos was very hard. And they're saying that we got a lot of people asking for solutions for the game because they found it difficult. So, and actually, we were talking about expansion pack. 20 quid for various MS Flight Simulator expansion packs that added stuff like 10 planes, 3 new airports. Like, that's quite a lot of money for these expansions. That talk about multiplayer coming home to roost for us here because they have Wired Gaming, where they talk about online games. And funny, they're talking about Half-Life quite a bit here because they're saying we don't have the game to review yet, but it's going to be a big Wired game. And of course they had to point out Tracy, MPlayer's new 20-year-old female columnist, because you have to point out you have a female columnist and how old she is. But they do go over some of the multiplayer games and what you can play on the MPlayer service, which used to be a sort of special dial-in thing. It was meant to give you better pings and stuff. It was quite cool, but yeah, it was one of those necessary things back then. And ooh, want to look at some hardware? It's funny how some of these things haven't really changed all that much. Like, you could release that steering wheel now, and it wouldn't look amiss these days. Same with some of these flight sticks. Like, my HOTAS setup is pretty much that, just with a lot more buttons. And it probably costs something similar. But they are very nice. And yeah, they have quite a few of these joysticks, including the Cyborg, which these were massively popular at the time, because you could rearrange all the different parts to make it fit your hand perfectly. And we have the classic Sidewinder. Yes, the hated D-pad that then showed up on the Xbox, but the actual shape and the hold of it was quite nice and the buttons were good. And then tucked away here we have the special one that actually motion sensed. And look at this, the Fragmaster. This is something I would love to get my hands on and try out. I have no idea how good or bad it actually is, but I think it would be fun to see. And they have a second Pentium 2 300 PC that you could win, and from another flight sim as well. And as we're coming through, we're starting to leave behind some of the reviews, and now we're starting to get onto some of the weirder stuff. Like, if you wanted to subscribe, and if you did, you could get one of these games free. Now, I'm not even sure that this lasted another year, so it'd be interesting to see if anyone got any refunds. And if you did want to sign up, well, there is a big cardboard bit that you could fill out all your details, and yeah, you expected to write your card number, tick all that lot off, and then just post this bit of card in the mail. Now, this subscription bit actually splits their first solution So they like to have full solutions to games, and this one is for conflict-free space. And yet they go into quite a lot of detail on each of the missions. Now, I can't remember if this is the entirety of the game or they will continue in the next issue, but sometimes they would split it over multiple issues. And yes, this is pretty much GameFAQs before GameFAQs was really a thing. It might have been a thing at this point, I can't remember when it launched, but this was more likely where you got your solutions to games like Mech Commander. And there is a lot of pages to Mech Commander. Just look at it. It just keeps going on and on. And when they have finished going over this game, well, it goes on a bit longer. And then they have some questions and answers for people asking for cheats or solutions to other games like The Last Express, Men in Black 2, Theme Hospital, Classic, and yeah, I can understand wanting to know how to complete Star Trek: A Final Unity. That one had me stumped for a while, I can tell you. Yeah. But it then continues to cheats. Yes, we have cheats for various games. And that's mostly where this ends. We have an advert for the unofficial PlayStation magazine where you can subscribe to it from this magazine rather than just getting a copy, but that's a thing. And then this is something quite cool. They got it at the very back here. The retro respect. And they talk about a retro game. And in this instance, it's the Formula 1 Grand Prix on the Amiga. And it's quite funny to think that in '98 they were doing retro reviews already. And it's quite cool. At the end it goes, so next time you're staring at the latest PC racing game, some miracle of 3D effects technology, remember the playability. And remember the lowly Amiga was doing it 8 years ago. It was. And it was glorious. And pretty much from this point on, they will talk about what was on the CDs. It's interesting that they decide to do this at the end of the magazine rather than at the front, which is what most would do. But yeah, it came with 19 demos. 19. And we got to see at least a few of them because we couldn't have checked all of those out. And good old Sentinel returns. And that's pretty much it. They then just have to pimp out their next issue and obviously Lara Croft. And then we have an advert for Special Reserve. Now there is a few of you who will remember Special Reserve, particularly from the Amiga days. You would see Special Reserve in the Amiga format magazines, etc. And yes, they'd obviously moved from selling Amiga games and hardware to PC stuff. And yet, including PC hardware as well. But yeah, some RAM, and well, did they really need that to advertise their stunningly low RAM prices? Is how low they're talking about here their standards, because that wasn't required. And well, this just leaves us with the back page, which was Carmageddon 2. And while this might have been more of a skim than a deep dive, it was a lot of fun. And amazingly, some of the games that it reviewed that I said I didn't remember, well, I found on the shelf over there. So this must have had a bit of a subconscious effect on me. And so, until next time, I've been the Goldfish. That was both Ultimate and PC, and this was Goldfish on Games. I have no idea if anyone actually managed to make it this far into the video, but if you managed to watch the entire hour, then thank you very much. You are awesome. And if you've not considered this before, you may want to try subscribing, liking, ringing that bell, all those other silly things that we YouTubers like you to do, because it boosts our ego. or you can check out 2 other videos that should be on the screen right now.